Hello everyone, I hope you're well and thank you for opening this podcast. How's the family history work going? Don't forget, in our hobby there's no such thing as a puzzle without an answer. It just takes time and perseverance, so stick at it. My name is Malcolm Noble and I want to start with the caution that I offer whenever I have an audience. I am neither professional nor expert in genealogy. I am no more than an amateur who has spent 40 years, well, more than 40 years, digging up his family tree. So I guess this series of podcasts is really me sharing with you the self-taught lessons. This evening I would like to share with you some thoughts on getting the most from wills written in Tudor England. Why am I choosing that restriction? Well, I guess it is in the Tudor times that we first turned to wills in our research. Those are the years when parish registers had only just got going. Their survival is down to accident and fortune rather than any design. And even when we're lucky enough to come across the early registers, I'm sure you've found, as I have, that they are exceptionally grudging and mean in the information that they offer. So when we come across a Tudor will, it is very much a treasure chest. And tonight I want to talk about how I go about getting the most from those wills. Of course, much that I'd say will apply to wills of any age. It's really the approach that matters. Now, I know that many of you will disagree with some of the things I'm going to say, and I hope that you will put forward those comments, because it's through those sort of arguments that I will increase my skills, and who knows, you might challenge one or two of your approaches. Now, a couple of early points. When you're working on a will, work only on that will. Do not be in a hurry to assimilate it with the other research which you have undertaken from other sources. That can come later. If you work solely on the document in front of you, then you will stop yourself from making any unfortunate assumptions. Try to think about it as the subject actually telling you about his life, property and family, so you'll want to listen. Another point is, if you have come across a transcript of the will, try to avoid working from that. If there is a transcript, it means that the will exists and is probably available to the public. So, obeying the golden rule of all genealogical research, go back and work from the original document. And the first thing that you'll want to do is make your own transcription. Now, you do this, as I'm sure you know, not by transcribing word for word. You transcribe letter by letter. And once you soon get the hang of it, it'll become very easy. When you take your first pass through the document, you will end up with a lot of gaps. Work on them, and you will eventually eliminate virtually all, if not all, of those puzzling words. For example, when I was working on the current document, I read that beneath the bed was a pea hole. Now, I found that absolutely enchanting. It was something that, metaphorically, I definitely wanted to look into. When I did a second part of the document, I found that there wasn't a pea hole under the bed. What there was a parlour under the bedroom. Now, those sort of errors can be avoided if you transcribe letter by letter. It is actually a fairly difficult discipline to adhere to. Going letter by letter, you will get used to the scribe's particular spelling. He may Latinize some of the words, and each scribe will do that in a different way, so it's important that you learn and get accustomed to how that particular scribe is working. Now, part of the fun of working on a will is imagining this relationship you've got with the scribe. He wrote the document 500 years ago, and here you are listening to what he's saying. Now, that might be a fairly colourful approach, but it really does work. And if you come across a will written completely in Latin, I'm afraid I'm clueless. I was taught Latin as a schoolboy by a very strict schoolmaster called Captain Lee, and as far as schoolboy Latin goes, I guess I held my own. But as far as reading a medieval or Tudor document, I'm afraid I am clueless. That is the sort of standard that we're talking about. And now at this stage, I'm going to suggest that we jump ahead. It may be that you've come to the will because you want to add names to the family tree. Now, I think that's less than half the work. But if it is a preoccupation, then let's get rid of that bother and draw a provisional family tree at this stage. But remember, draw it only from the information that you get from the will, ignoring any previous research, and write it as detailed as you sensibly can, and I mean carefully. Remember that you're likely to come back to these notes many years hence. And if you're not here many years hence, then perhaps somebody else will want to read your notebook. So please be as helpful as you can. Write clearly and legibly. Write it as if you're intending someone else to read it. Once you have drawn the family tree, give each name on the family tree a page or perhaps 2 pages to themselves. You're going to want to add notes later on. Furthermore, give a page to each person named in the will, whether they are beneficiaries or not, whether they are part of the family or not, and include in that the witnesses. The witnesses are very important, as we shall see. Now, returning to the will, the first thing that you may want to identify is the date that the will was made. Was it close to the subject's death? Again, drawing on my current work, Christopher Marsh, in his excellent book on nonconformity in East Anglia, paints a rather vivid picture of a Mr. Bartholomew Tassel making his will while the scribe and the witnesses were sitting at the bedside. Now, we don't know if that is true or not, but it does paint a very nice picture. He was able to do that because he identified that the date of the subject's death was only a few days after the drawing up of the will. Now, none of this comes with guarantees, but you'll want to transcribe carefully the probation or the note when the will was proved after your ancestor's death. Also, if you've drawn it from a county records office or other archive, they may be able to show you the sleeve or wrapper that the person who originally accepted the will put it in before storing it. We can hope that this too will provide a useful date and perhaps, if we're lucky, a snippet or 2 of other information. If the will contains an additional note, then question that and look at if the circumstances of your ancestor has changed, or if he's responding to any changed context. We'll expand a bit more on that later. Also note at this stage how he calls himself. Is he a gentleman? Is he a yeoman? Now, as an aside, it's worth mentioning that the ground between a gentleman and a yeoman was reducing at this time. Few people stuck to the old rules that only a person with the right to bear arms could term himself a gentleman. It was more popularly accepted that a gentleman was someone who did not work with his hands. A yeoman would be either the primary farmer in the parish or someone of that status. A yeoman was well-to-do. But it is worth giving attention to how your ancestor called himself in his will. It's how he was prepared to present himself, certainly to his scribe, and how he expected to be accepted by others. There may also have been an unwritten implication that he expected his children to come up to scratch. Remember, this is his last testament, and he may also have been anxious to record his success in life. Certainly, class was important. At the beginning of the will be a religious bequest of his soul and body, and many people gloss over this. But I think it's important, and we should look at it for any indication of whether your ancestor was following the old religion or the Reformed religion. For example, any mention of the Blessed Virgin Mary is likely to indicate Catholicism. And we can also look for more fundamental nonconformity. Now, many people disagree with me and believe that this religious bequest at the beginning of the will was formulaic, and certainly these were dangerous times when it would not be healthy to surprise many people with an unusual bequest of the soul. But it would be remiss of us to pass over that paragraph lightly, because it can tell us something important about our ancestor. So we're now at the stage when we can go through the will and make an inventory of the property left by your ancestor. We will have a list of your ancestor's property, and also on each of the family members page in your notebook, we can record the property that was left to them along with any comments about them. Oh, by the way, I hope that you've numbered your notebook, because you'll want to index it in your catalogue with brief subject headings of the notes that you've taken. Once we have listed the inventory, we will be able to look at our evidence and make some interpretation about the ancestor's household, his lands, his business, and his family. As we listen to some more Handel, thanks to Freeze FX for the royalty-free clip, I want to remind you that you're listening to Working on Tudor Wills, part of a series of podcasts that will show that family trees talk. On the website, talkgenealogy.wordpress, you'll find some show notes to the episode. I've had to put aside two large elements of the subject for later talks: how we find the will in the first place, and how we can investigate any inventory that may have been attached to later Tudor wills. They are both meaty subjects that need 30 minutes to themselves. Tonight I'm trying to emphasise what we can learn from a simple will if we adopt an acquisitive approach. Even without an inventory, there's much that we can learn. Let's look at his house. In the example I used above, we've established that there is a parlour directly beneath the main bedchamber. We also know that the chamber has a side room, and there is room for 3 other beds, at least, in other rooms. We know that the main chamber is big enough to hold 3 chests. That may be a long way from an architectural drawing, but at least we have some initial clues. The furniture listed is of course the furniture that is bequeathed. It does not list necessarily all the furniture in the house. Later in the will there is likely to be provision for residual property being divided, and that could include the rest of your ancestor's furniture and not necessarily the lesser amounts. Your ancestor may have listed the acreage of land that he owns, and maybe even the field names and their locations. Or he may have listed the crops that he grows, giving an indication perhaps of the soil quality. But it's necessary to read these things carefully. For example, my ancestor makes a distinction between his stable yards and his plough yards. He certainly did not think of them as the same ground. But in the example I've used, it is the monetary requests that interest me. Here was a man who owned 5 farm horses, a number of geldings, at least 1 cow, as well as fields producing 5 different types of crop. And yet he left, in monetary terms, exactly £250. Multiply that by 20 and we have a very, very rough guide of something less than £5,000 in today's value. Of that 250, he expected only £67 to be available immediately on his death. The rest would have to be raised within a year from either sales or, more likely, given the timescale, the yield from next year's harvest. This gives us some signposts to his business mind, to use a modern term, his liquidity, and the yields that he was expecting from his farm. He is also telling us what sort of burden he thought it reasonable to pass on to his son who took over the farm. Here are a number of clues, and with work I hope to be able to interpret them further. I will need to look at the average yield for different crops in the area, East Anglia, during Tudor times. I will want to look at the type of harvests that he had been experiencing before his death. The years of good and bad harvests are quite readily available. And of course, I need to look at the field history of the parish so that I can begin to locate his farm. Here I hope I'm giving you some sort of grasp of the sort of research work that can come out of a simple will. Now let us look at those pages for the different family members, and let us consider not just the amount that each member was being given, but also the purpose of the bequest. Let's start with the people who apparently got a raw deal. For example, his eldest son is given scant attention. But that does not mean necessarily that there had been a falling out. It may be that he had already provided for his eldest son during his lifetime. Not an unreasonable measure, especially if they were in some sort of partnership. Again, further work may be able to put a bit of flesh on that argument. And the will may give us some indication of the ages of grandchildren and the younger children. The bequests may be dependent on them meeting a certain age, often 15. And for women, the bequests are not granted until they reach 21. Now, this may seem unfair. For example, a young woman with the promise of a bequest, although not quite a dowry, certainly ups herself in the marriage market. Now, that may seem odd, it may seem unfair to modern eyes, but what the ancestor was doing was trying to provide for his granddaughter's future. In the same way, my ancestor left to his wife his best known cow, except he wasn't leaving a cow at all. He was leaving a source of perpetual cheese production, and so was providing her with an income for the future. And since the cow would have to live somewhere, he was certainly implying that he expected his wife to continue to have access or stake in the farm business. So perhaps we now have enough grasp of the will that we can usefully turn to those pages in your notebook dedicated to each of the family members. Try to build up a profile for each of them. Think of it as their LinkedIn profile, setting out their timeline, their interests, the places they knew, and their connections. I'm sure that you'll find plenty of gaps that you'll want to research further. And now you can bring in your previous research and note any discrepancies that need sorting out. Why do I say that you should do this for other people mentioned in the will, particularly the witnesses? Well, on a purely practical level, you might be surprised, or perhaps you won't, by the number of times that a witness to the will brings in one of the daughters or granddaughters into their own family. Maybe insider trading isn't such a new phenomenon after all. But your ancestor wanted the names of these people recorded on his last will and testament, and for me that's reasons enough why I would want to flesh out their life story. He took them into his confidence. They may have known more about what lay in store than his own children and wife knew. Did he trust them? Were they reliable? Were they merely prominent people that he expected to stand up for his bequests? That's for you to find out. You will certainly discover what was going on around the parish at the time, and for that reason I would recommend that you also look at other wills made at the same time in the same location. I hope that in this podcast I've given you some indication of the lines that you can follow when you go through a Tudor will in detail. I guess that you'll want to put on your Wellington boots and go and tread the ground. And here we might return to the very beginning when we spoke about the bequest of your ancestor's soul. If he left any bequest to the church, does evidence of that survive in the church? And if not now, look at the old guidebooks and see if there was evidence in years gone by. From working on old wills, I've been impressed by how much our ancestors were driven to rule from the grave. Did things turn out as he wanted them to? Making the most of a Tudor will takes time. In my first draft of this podcast, I suggested that you should put aside a year to do the work. My guess is that in many years' time, you'll still be working on it. Thank you for listening for the podcast, and I hope that some of the things that I've said have been of interest to you. Please let me know. And in the meantime, of course, the best of luck with your family tree.